When I first started as a buyer's agent, and I had a whole bunch of fallacies. And in fact, I think I need to do a whole podcast episode on this. All the things that I thought that I'd be doing when I went from sales to buying, and all the fallacies that went along with that. And one of the fallacies was around defense housing. And so I just tell you my little story, and then you can sort of decide whether that applies to NDIS as an investment opportunity for clients as well, right? Because obviously investors want to buy property that's going to have good cash flow, good yield, and they're going to feel like they don't have to worry about it, right? And also, I'm a total supporter of helping our disadvantaged people in this country get good accommodation. And everybody has a right to have secure accommodation. So this is not about whether it's right or wrong or whether good or bad. This is about, as an investor, whether to, how to look at this. So my fallacy when I first started as a buyer's agent was stemming from being a sales agent, how I had sold some properties that were owned by defense housing. And they were then leased. So whoever bought them had a up to, I think, 15-year lease with the Department of Defence. And so there were guaranteed yield, the fees were quite high, but, the properties were upgraded on a routine basis, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of straight numbers, some of these leases looked really attractive. Others actually didn't look so attractive, where they had much higher fees associated with it. But what was interesting is that when I was selling them, if they had a long run to go on their lease, they were really unpopular with buyers. Even typical investors weren't really going for them. So a typical local investor wasn't necessarily going to go for a property. And there were a number of townhouses in very good areas, such as in Rozelle and Balmain, for instance. But your typical investors like, no, I don't really want to be tied up in that type of arrangement. So there was a small pool of investor that was likely to go for it. And typically what we found when I was selling these, that these investors were definitely outside of our normal area. They were different investors to what we normally dealt with. Now, interestingly enough, when these properties came up towards the end of their lease, they had a massive increase in value, huge increase in value. And that's because they were well located, so they're pretty bland townhouses, to be quite honest. The actual building itself was pretty bland, pretty vanilla. But their value had been held back because they only appealed to investors. So I had this whole idea, this great scheme, this great idea that I was going to race out there and find all this defense housing out there, in Sydney, wherever. I didn't have to just be in the area that I knew well, and find defense housing that came on the market that were getting towards the end of the lease. So within, say, 2 years of the end of the lease. And I thought there's going to be a big uplift in value, right? But I tell you what, they were located mostly in B and C grade areas. So, and the lack of scarcity in those areas, and these properties weren't necessarily the top end of what was available in those areas either. And, ultimately I just found that was just a lot of crap that was hitting the market that was only appealing to a certain type of investor. So it's not even like an appeal to the entire pool of investors. Very, very limited market. And you could definitely see that the restriction on capital growth that came as a result of that. So I ditched the strategy because it didn't work. Now, if I stuck to that strategy, I would have bought a lot of underperforming properties for clients. And, years down the track, I would have the benefit of hindsight to look back and go, oh, what a shame. I acted in these lovely, highfalutin, great strategy, great in theory. But the reality is, as a professional, I helped my clients buy crap. Thankfully, I didn't do that. And so that's some of the dangers. And so quite often people will come to you with these ideas. It's like the granny flat strategy. I know, I've heard it somewhere. This must be a great idea for investors. And so that's the test for NDIS properties from an investor's point of view, is you've got to be thinking of yourself as an individual investor. You do. That's a fact, right? The government needs to be looking after people better than they are in terms of housing, but you as one-off individual investor needs to be thinking about yourself. And so you've got to look at the lens of if it is a property that is going to be it looks like a good investment from an NDIS perspective because you're going to definitely have tenants in place and it's going to be managed and all that sort of stuff. Who's your ultimate buyer going to be? How long are you tied up for? Where's the location? Is it the type of property that would perform well on the open market? All of these sort of foundational questions are really important. But I can totally get this idea that investors have in their mind. They get fixated on these ideas. And we just got to be very careful as buyers agents to unpick them very carefully and really be critical when we look at them. So there you go. There's a good example of one of my fallacies that got I was quickly disabused of.